G'day, welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. I'm Pete Wargent from Alan Wargent Property Buyers. I'm here with Chris Bates from the Alcove Group, the mortgage specialist. G'day, Chris. Today we're going to talk about migration, and we're going to do a bit of a deep dive as promised. So I guess you're somebody who spent a bit of time overseas, and I've lived in a few different countries. So I've got a few insights, hopefully, into the pros and cons of immigration and what it all means for our housing markets and the way we choose to live.
Yeah, it's such a topical conversation that everyone's got their own perspective on it, often because of what they're dealing with as an individual or their family's dealing with, and not so much a bigger picture. I think today's episode, we want to try to zoom out a little bit, talk about the pros and the cons and some of the issues that it's creating now and whether, what changes potentially we need to think about. I do think it's a really hot topic right now, but I also think that a lot of people in Australia are either born overseas or their parents were born overseas. And we're a big country and, we're compared to world, we've still got a very small population but we have absolutely got issues right now because we are one of the faster growing countries around the world. And I think today's conversation is around how do we manage that? A lot of countries around the world would love the people moving to their country at the rate that we get in Australia. And should we look a gift horse in the mouth, I think, or should we sort of embrace migration, and what sort of is the right level? I think these are all great questions. I don't say we have the answers for them, but I think just having a discussion around it and the impacts it's having on our property market is a good conversation.
It is very topical at the moment. As you said, about 30% of Australians were born overseas, myself included, actually. And if you include parents in that figure, so Australians with an overseas born parents, then suddenly the number jumps to about half. And 30% born overseas is the highest share in about 120 years or so. So yeah, it's very topical subject. And I guess the latest arrivals and departures figures just in the past week showed an acceleration for a seventh month in a row on a net basis, permanent and long-term arrivals plus 467,000 over the year to August. And this is happening at a time when we completed only 40,000 dwellings over the most recent quarter and 177,000 over the financial year. So you can see why it's topical, because we've got rapid immigration at a time when housing supply is very slow. I think there was, during the pandemic period, we had the border closures for a while, which we'll talk about. And of course, housing prices didn't plunge when we shut the borders. But I do think, I remember Gareth Brown from Forager Fund saying, well, that's kind of a bit of system one thinking, is that, yeah, okay, we closed the borders and property prices didn't crash because interest rates went to zero. But I think the sort of zoomed out or the system two thinking is, well, yeah, but we kind of knew immigration would rebound eventually when the borders reopened, and therefore people took the opportunity to buy property as interest rates fell. But if there was a longer term expectation of population decline, like there is in Japan or South Korea or now China, then we'd probably take a different view. There'd be less FOMO around buying well-located property. So what we'll talk about today, Chris, is firstly, we'll talk about what the migration numbers show over the past 10 and 20 years. Then we'll talk about some of the negatives or the cons around immigration. And then we'll look at some of the positives around immigration settings. And then finally, we'll look at some of the internal or interstate numbers and how people are choosing to live and where, and the impacts on the housing market. And hopefully we'll come up with some kind of conclusion or balanced perspective at the end of it. So let's have a look first then at the net overseas migration figures. So I guess a migrant is defined, I'm just quoting here, as somebody who stays in Australia for 12 months within a 16-month period, regardless of the visa type. So that could be permanent migrants. It could be students who stay here for more than 12 months in a 16-month period, and sometimes even New Zealand citizens as well. So Australia's permanent migration target for 2026 financial year is 185,000 places, skill stream 132,000, and family stream 52,500. So, and then I guess these are kind of a subset of the bigger number for migration, because you might have things like temporary visa holders coming in, and some of those will go on to become longer term residents. Well, let's go back 20 years So if we go back to around 2005, we had sort of a steady growth in migration before the global financial crisis. In 2007, for the first time in a decade, we had 243,000 net overseas migrations. That was the first time in a decade we gone over 200,000. And it's sort of in the boom period, we got as high as 283,000 in 2008. Then, of course, we had the global financial crisis and things pulled back again. And I suppose things are sort of running along in that sort of 200 to 250 kind of level. Then we got the pandemic and we had a negative net overseas migration in 2021 because the borders were closed. Some people went home and we lost 89,000 people. But then we've had this massive snapback, which is why immigration is topical. So the last 3 financial years, 2022, we had 387,000. 2023, 536,000. So that was the post-COVID peak, driven a lot by students and temporary workers and that reopening rebound. And then in 2024 financial years, we had some government caps on students and so on. So we're back down to 446,000. Now, the figures for this financial year are only preliminary. It looks like we could be somewhere around 400,000. So let's say over 20 years, we've got a net gain of just over 5 million. So we're averaging at 250,000 net overseas migration. So, Chris, I guess if you look at that in the international context, these are big numbers, 5 million migrants in 20 years. Plus, we've got the natural growth in the population in Australia. So not every country has that. For example, in the UK, we actually have more deaths than births because we've got an aging or elderly population. Australia is still growing because a lot of our migrants are under 30 and it reduces the average age. So if you look at that in the context of a population around 27.5 million or so, it's a massive chunk, isn't it? In 20 years, we've added 5 million just from net overseas migration.
So yeah, I do worry about that at the moment. I do worry that, at the moment we're all just jumping on the bandwagon and a lot of the issues will sort of work their way through. I mean, when you look at temporary migration, which is a lot of, you go on the ABS, you look at overseas migration stats, it's been a lot of the big driver in recent years is, temporaries. And, from talking to, some different people, even last week I was talking to recruiters and he was saying, like, it's just so hard for us to, come over here and, get someone on a working holiday visa and then give them a job. It's just, the cost to do so and the risk, it just doesn't really happen like it used to. And, they were tech recruiters, recruiters in the tech industry. And I said, like, that's just not really an option for them. So, yeah, I don't know, Pete, that would be my take on this as well, is that maybe we need to zoom out, take a longer term view and go, is it structurally a long-term issue, or have we just got a bit of let too many sort of temporary visa holders in the recent years? And is that going to wash through because they are temporary and then a lot of them don't stay here? I don't know, Pete, what do you think of that?
Well, I think the surprising thing to me when I look at those numbers is I remember in the mining boom years when practically if you could fog up a mirror, you'd get a job because there was such a shortage of skilled workers around. And I remember sometimes the employers paying people bonuses just for turning up, or sometimes people would just get a pay rise because employers didn't want to lose people to another higher paying job. And so it kind of made sense in the early 2000s that we got a big surge in immigration because the mining boom was really teeing off. The surprising thing to me was when we came down the other side of the mining boom post 2011, 2012, is that immigration just carried on. It's almost like we sort of realized this sort of magic pudding economics, and it was obviously an easy lever for governments to pull. So even though we didn't have the same skill shortages after 2012 or thereabouts or 2013, we just carried on with big immigration, and now it's a feature of the system. It's just embedded. So yeah, I think there's definitely the case that since the reopening, we've never had 3 or 4 financial years like that, back to back to back, with enormous positive net overseas migration numbers. And of course, it's difficult for the system to digest. I suppose people might say, well, yes, but if you take out the financial year where we lost a load of people, we're kind of where we might have expected to be. If COVID had never happened, the population would be quite similar to where it is today. But of course, there was a lot of disruption through that time. to all kinds of things, and particularly to the supply of materials and labor and things like that. So yes, and it's not just Australia that's going through those challenges. Lots of other countries have had similar challenges. Canada, massive housing shortages. New Zealand went through shortages of building materials and things like that. So it would by no means unique in that regard. And things will eventually rebalance, I'm sure, as dwelling construction picks up. But in the short term, yes, everyone's feeling the cost of living pressures and some of the pressures on housing and infrastructure as well. So, well, let's start. We know from intergenerational reports and government rhetoric about the positives of immigration, and we'll talk about those in a while. But let's just go through the counter arguments first, because obviously there's no sort of perfect setting here. And when you sort of bring in larger numbers of people, of course, there's going to be some cons or downsides. So let's step through 4 of those first. So I suppose the first one is pressure on infrastructure, particularly housing, as we've seen. At the moment, we've got rental vacancy rates at practically the lowest on record. So that's clearly one challenge for younger people in particular, trying to get a rental property. In some cases, key workers can't find rentals close to where they need to work, close to schools, for example. And even just on the roads, we've seen some challenges because the infrastructure is sometimes finding it difficult to keep up. Transport, education, particularly in some of the urban centres. So that's definitely one challenge around big immigration numbers. If you get 5 million new arrivals over 20 years, that's going to create some challenges. Second one, on the economic side of things, well, certainly I think in the lower skilled sectors of the economy, if you get big numbers of new arrivals, there's more competition for jobs, and it does have an impact on wages for local workers. So we did see that. So that's been an ongoing debate for the past 20 years. Well, we saw when the pandemic happened, of course, people working in retail or working in cafes and restaurants or entertainment, suddenly they got a big bump in their wages because there was so much less competition. So it's quite clear that if you run a big immigration program, of course, that's going to have some impact on wages, even though we do have heavily unionized sectors of the economy in Australia. I think as well, just sometimes when you get big numbers of new arrivals, there are integration challenges as well, language barriers and things like that. So there's definitely some challenges on the economy. Thirdly, social cohesion. Now, I would say Australia, I'm a bit like the US. Australia is by and large built on immigration over the past couple of 100 years. So I guess it's a bit different. So for the United Kingdom, for example, from 1066 until 2000, we didn't really get much immigration at all. And then suddenly since 2000, we've seen more immigration in 25 years than we saw in the preceding 1,000 years. And that has changed the dynamic. We've gone from a nation of really not based on immigration to suddenly a massive increase. And it's when you look at political polling in the UK, immigration is the number one issue of concern for voters. In Australia, not so much. I think, as you said at the start, Chris, because 30% of Aussies are born overseas anyway, and about half of us are either born overseas or have overseas-born parents. I think it's kind of understood that Australia has been built on immigration. But I suppose that if you bring in large numbers of people from different cultures quickly, I mean, Europe is finding out at the moment that, yes, you do get social cohesion concerns, and Victoria has been in the media quite a bit in the last week or two for similar reasons. So, yeah, and, you see this sometimes on social media, people sort of complaining about rapid changes to the national identity and so on. So, yeah, those are concerns. I would say Australia has, by and large, managed this way better than most European countries, though. And then fourthly, just from an environmental perspective, of course, you're going to have pressures on things like water, energy, land resources, and Australia obviously is prone to drought periodically. So from an environmental point of view, if we're bringing in big numbers of people, we have to cut down, sometimes we have to go into national parks or cut down trees, and obviously there's more water requirements and so on. So I guess those are some of the downsides, Chris. What are your thoughts on some of those areas?
Yeah, I think if you look at the stats, and I'm trying to focus this episode as much as we can on as much data as we can rather than personal opinion, right? Like I'm just looking at points that I can sort of find. if you look at the last few years, I do think a lot of it's been catch up for student visas, right? A lot of our universities had to basically fill up their coffers of international students. And you have to sort of also question, like, I think in the postgraduate, a lot of them are, I haven't got the stat in front of me, sort of overseas students. A lot of money the universities make, and it's a big part of our economy is our universities. I just think we just need to accept that, we have to have an economy. We have to make, grow it, whether it's through tourism or it's through, selling, cutting stuff out of the ground and selling it and exporting, or it's our agricultural, or it's our banking system, or it's our property market. Like there has to be, let's just think that overseas students coming to Australia is a big part of our economy now. And I don't know if you sort of agree with that, Pete, as well. But, what these students do need to live somewhere. I think you've got a government that's also gone on a spending boom at a time when we haven't really been building enough dwellings. And a lot of the costs that go into building new apartments and new housing and goes to the governments in taxes. It's just the way the system is. You look at the cost of a house and land package, maybe half of it goes to the government in lots of different taxes along the way, and lots of different governments along the way. So yeah, I think it's this student intake. So I think a lot of people are really upset because the students need to live somewhere. They can't go into student housing. And I think there needs to be more pressure on universities. And I think that's also what they're saying is that, hey, if you want more international students, you need to prove to us that you're actually building student housing and you're, at least trying to help with that problem. Because if they do go into the rental market and then they're competing with key worker housing and young Australians who are sort of trying to have a job in the city, I think that's why you can see a real rental shortage. But that's also because the government attacked investors and they say, hey, investors, we're going to slug you with all these taxes and blah, 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 and, anti-investor, and it's hard to get in straight. And so investors have been pushed out of the market as well and went to regional areas. And a lot of that was because the building issues in the off the plan segment was so vast and so exposed that investors said, hang on a sec, I'm not going to keep building these apartments for these students and buying these apartments. I'm going to go and buy things that actually go up in value. And so yeah, it's kind of people are blaming the students, but is it you should be blaming maybe the government for lots of other issues here, Pete? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a concern that the universities have become completely dependent upon international students to fund the whole economic model. I don't think that's an issue per se. I guess the concern that people have is, well, if you're diluting the quality of degrees because people are paying the fees, then that would be an issue. And it's a long time since I've been in a university, but that's what people tell me is that there are concerns sometimes with the grads and postgrads at language barriers. Sometimes people are sort of getting through degrees that they might not otherwise pass because the universities want to see international student revenue. But yeah, as a part of the economy, no question. If you look at the growth sectors over the past 30 years, well, the number of international students, we used to have enrollments under 100,000. Now they're into the many hundreds of thousands. So it's been a massive growth sector. And yeah, I think it does have an impact on the housing market. So I think there will be some moves to require universities to provide some student accommodation if they're going to continue taking in big numbers. But it does, it sort of has an overflow impact on the housing market and actually on the labour market as well, because a lot of students do come to Australia, but they do work at various points in time as well, in things like hospitality, for example. So yeah, it's I mean, just by sheer weight of numbers, it definitely has an impact. But I don't think we should look at a gift horse in the mouth either, because it has been an enormous source of growth. And often students sort of go on to become permanent visa holders later on. And that's obviously a benefit for Australia if we've got people with skills and degrees that want to stay in the country. Well, that's obviously a net plus, particularly if they've got STEM degrees.
Yeah, and that's what I think, Pete. Like we have to, a kid's born in Australia, you've got childcare and you've got all the schooling that we sort of subsidise and we pay for, and then they, hopefully they add value to our economy when they finish university one day. I mean, if someone just comes here, pays a lot of money for a degree, and then is qualified and then is in our economy, adding value, like, is that a bad thing, Pete? I don't know. Like, is it a better model when the fertility rate, is sort of been dropping? We're sort of not replacing the amount of people that, having less kids per couple, I guess. So what's your take on that, Pete? So declining birth rates all around the world. And what's the issue if that sort of played out for the next 30, 40 years and we didn't add in a lot of young couples and, singles that are going to then potentially have kids and top up? Is there an issue there that we're sort of brewing?
Yeah, you know what? Actually, just a chat that I was engaged in at some point on social media over the past week, and somebody was pointing out that if you went back to, let's say, the 1970s, trade unions and sort of the left side of or progressive side of politics, they weren't really that keen on big immigration because it would undercut wages, and also there was a kind of moral aspect to this, in that why should a developed country just take the most skilled people from a developing country? And there's been plenty of that going on in Western nations in recent times, because if a developed nation can take all the qualified doctors out of a country in Africa, well, happy days. You're adding to, you've got a skill shortage for sort of healthcare practitioners, and you can just take people from Nigeria or elsewhere, and it's a benefit to us. But then what's the impact on the source country? Now, sometimes money gets paid back via remittances, but in any case, those two viewpoints, certainly on the left or progressive side of politics, they don't really seem to be talked about these days. People talk a lot less about the impact on wages, and they don't seem too concerned about the impact on developing nations. And I say that as somebody who did live in a developing country for a number of years. And of course, you see that people, the best and brightest, they graduate and they want to go and live in Portugal or go to Europe and better themselves. And I would do exactly the same. But then, of course, it has a deleterious impact on the source country. So I've completely forgotten why you asked me, Chris. But yeah, I think, yes, there is, of course, a lot of benefit. And in fact, Australia arguably benefited for somebody like me. I did my schooling and education in England. And then when I got some qualifications and skills, I came into Australia, and they get a taxpayer on day one without having to subsidise any of the schooling. So, of course, there's a benefit to Australia, less of a benefit to the source country.
Yeah, what's your sort of take, Pete, as well? I mean, I know we're jumping around a little bit here, but, of a lot of Australians maybe not left Australia as much as they used to, is Australia become more desirable over the last 5 years than it was, say, in the 2015s, job opportunities overseas, maybe I should move to the UK or the US or, to Asia. And maybe that just has also, created extra pressure. And maybe Aussies moving back has also been a little bit because they're going, well, the COVID sort of, maybe I want to be closer to my parents, maybe I'm a bit concerned about living far away right now. And so how do you think that's played into things, Pete, where, typically we did have a bit of a brain drain? Like, so while we were importing a lot of people to come to Australia, we did have a lot of our talent moving overseas. And maybe as our country sort of develops, maybe people less likely to go overseas. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that has happened, particularly to London, actually. It used to be the big trip. It used to be for a lot of Aussies. I remember seeing them outside the High Commission and in the pubs along the Strand. Going to Europe, particularly to London, was a massive thing. That's become a bit harder to do. I think as well, there's some other impacts. One is the cost of travel has gone up a lot, but also I think in the peak of the mining boom years, Australia's dollar, it's easy to forget. We had a dollar that was very, very strong. And at one stage, it was like $1.10 against the US, so we could travel almost anywhere in the world and live like a king. But that's kind of reversed since the mining boom came down the other side. So now the Aussie dollar doesn't go as far. I remember going to the US 12 months ago, and it's phenomenally expensive to use an Aussie dollar over there now. So there's a couple of things that have, the cost of travel has gone up a lot over the past 5 years, but also the currency doesn't go as far. And I think as well, Aussies are picking out other locations to go. I think it used to be that people would go to the UK, but probably that's a bit less popular now.
Yeah, and I think that what's your thought about this, delaying, housing, so it's like all of a sudden people the need for housing is so great right now when they're actually wanting to buy because they've left it so late, right? And that in itself creates a lot of tension, right? So like if you're looking to buy a house and you're sort of in your mid-20s or 30s and you're like, well, we're not having kids. But unfortunately, because the price of it, it's becoming more and more topical because it's so, desired when they're actually trying to buy. And it becomes much more frustrating because the kids and, starting a family is, imminent.
I think if you look at the fertility rate statistics, at least a part of that is that people are doing everything later than they used to. I think people do take things like gap years, but yes, people are getting married later. Certainly, they're having kids much later than they used to. In our case, we were late 30s. People are putting things off a lot later than they used to. But the same thing as well, getting their first property. It used to be quite common for people to leave school or graduate and then try and get straight onto the housing ladder. But that seems to be less urgency around it now. So yeah, it does certainly create a lot of pressure, particularly, certainly I know in my case, that as soon as you have children, your whole life perspective changes. Things that you thought were important suddenly seem a whole lot less important. And I think there's a thing in demographics. We tend to think of ourselves as being unique and individual, but actually we do sort of tend to do a lot of the same things at the same times in life. So yeah, there's certain demographic changes that have created extra pressure on the housing market. One is that there's more divorces and separations these days. So we end up with there's certainly the number of persons per dwelling was in a downtrend for decades and decades, and more older people living on their own, more people end up separating and living on their own. So that sort of creates an extra demand for more dwellings per person. It's gone up and down a bit in recent years, but if you look at the long-term trend, it's only been down. So yeah, there's certainly a few sort of shifts in the way in which people live. And we've just got more choices these days. There's more things to do, more things to spend your money on. So yeah, maybe it's a bit more dynamic. I think back in our parents' day, it was a job for life or a career for life. And a lot revolved around just getting on the housing ladder and staying on. But people are much more fluid and flexible these days.
Yeah, and I think if you think, we've got a lot of people who have moved here from all over the world, but they've also got family that is still all over the world, right? And so, the Australian economy is built a lot on tourism, and people are coming to Australia, to see the country, but often they're coming to see family, right? And they do need somewhere to stay. Yeah, sometimes they can stay with family, but often they can't. So there's that's obviously a rise in Airbnb, extended stays. That goes into our hotels, and then they spend money when they're here. And so I think that's another thing that also causes a bit of tension because, when you have got a fast growing population, a lot of people are moving here from around the world, their family come and their family want to move here as well, which is rightfully the case. And I think, what's your sort of thoughts on this, Pete, though, where, if we have got a lot of student migration here, should we be much more targeted in the students that we want to move here based on what we think are the long-term skill gaps we have as a country? If this is the model we're on, man, maybe we should be just really much more targeted and say, okay, yeah, you can have international students, but we really need them to be studying, these degrees because this is what we really need as a country. So being much more explicit in terms of what the uni courses they can offer.
Oh, completely. I think there'll be a lot of other countries thinking along similar lines, of course. So there's lots of competition. But if you look at the skills that are really going to be needed, sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics, those are really going to be the key skills over the decades ahead, especially as things like AI and technology and data centers really take off. But of course, we'll be competing with New Zealand and Canada and the US and other parts of Europe for those same students. I think on the short-term arrivals point, it's a really good point, Chris, because we tend to think of the population as kind of like a fixed number. We get the estimated resident population. But of course, in the real world, there's people coming and going all the time. If you look at the most recent month of stats, about 800,000 short-term arrivals in August, and a lot of people going the other way as well, traveling overseas. So I think the economy has become more seasonal over time. When you look at those short-term arrival stats, they're up about 14% from a year earlier. So we're in a long, slow recovery from 2019, when we might have seen about 1 million people potentially arriving on a short-term basis in a month. But when you look at the reasons people travel, yes, tourism, also the things like business, but very often visiting family in Australia as well. So yes, there's certain times of year like Christmas where we get this big demographic shifts and people come to Australia for New Year. That some of the international students go home. So yeah, we tend to sort of think of the population as a fixed number, but of course in the real world, there's people are coming and going. Students are in and out with turn times. Tourism is busier in the sort of summer months and quieter in winter. So yeah, I think. And we certainly saw that during the pandemic, is that the population is much more flexible than we think. And when there was a big change, for example, people didn't want to live in the inner cities where they couldn't use the amenities in big tower blocks. Suddenly, everyone moved out to the regions to get extra space and fresh air and being away from other people. And yeah, I think we underestimate just how flexible the population can be, even though we tend to sort of think of it as a fixed number.
What's your thoughts, Pete? I mean, there is a lot of argument that, it's actually forcing Australians to up their game, right? There's the argument that when you get more people moving here, they're going to take the jobs of the people who are living here, but they are going to take the jobs if they do a better job, right? And I think, what's your thoughts? We've got a productivity problem in Australia. It's very well documented. Is there a bit of a complacency that, we had it good, we're the lucky country, no recession for 30 years, is it also just, challenging Australians to sort of up their productivity to really stay, because we are in a global workforce, that's the world we live in, so what's your take on that, Pete? That maybe it's also, forcing us to, skill up as a society rather than just accept that, jobs are just always going to be there.
That is true. I think that there are certain things that don't outsource very well. One of them is construction. You can't easily sort of outsource the construction of a new data center or hospital or school or house to Asia. You have to have the staff here. You have to have the materials here. When I look back, when I first came to Australia in the 1990s, when I look back I used to live down in the Shire, the people who've sort of fared best in inverted commas have often been people in the trades. I think if you can learn a skill like a sparky, or if you work in the building trade, or if you're a plumber or something like that, well, those skills are in such high demand in Australia that it's the opportunity to earn big money either in mining or also in construction and development. I mean, there's been some tremendous opportunities there for people with those skills. I think it's harder if you sort of work in things like hospitality or entertainment, because yes, you are competing with a bigger and lower skilled workforce of people from overseas. So it kind of depends, I think. But yeah, these are some of the sort of the points that people make in favour of immigration. In fact, why don't we run through those? We've got sort of 4 migration pros. And we see a lot of this reported periodically in things like the intergenerational report, where people talk about immigration sort of adding to demand in the economy, but also increasing the participation rate, more people working, reducing the dependency ratio, and so on. So I suppose that's the first point, is economic growth. So if you get skilled migration, the idea is it fills labour shortages in things like particularly healthcare, but also engineering and tech. It increases the number of consumers in the economy, of course, so that contributes to GDP, and we need more schools and transport projects and service stations and shopping centres. And also there's an argument that I'm not really sure how good the stats are on this, but migrants, because they're people who are dynamic and have already moved overseas, then they're likely to be entrepreneurial and start businesses and create jobs themselves. I'm not really sure what the ABS stats show on migrant-owned businesses. I mean, yes, there's a contribution. I don't know if they're more likely to be entrepreneurial. I think I don't know. It's probably, I would like to see some stats on that. Good. It's an interesting point, but I'm not sure. The second point, and this is really a philosophical one, is cultural diversity. So you often see, people say, well, immigration brings multicultural enrichment. You said 30% of Aussies born overseas. So that increases global connections to places like China and India in recent years. And I mean, as I said, Australia is by and large a country that's been built on immigration. So, that's kind of natural. I think this is more of a sort of a philosophical point, really. Personally, I'm a xenophile. I like travel, and therefore I like seeing things like new cuisine and cultures come to a country. And when you go to Heathrow Airport, you see all these signs up everywhere saying diversity is our strength. But yeah, I mean, I suppose that's a personal thing. I personally like it. I know other people say, well, why do we need to continually have different cultures mixing? I think it's if you looked at it from a purely philosophical viewpoint, if you had a perfect sort of nation of people, then would adding diversity actually make it better? I think it adds more variety, and therefore that could be a strength. But of course, in Europe's case, it's the social cohesion has been the challenge. But I'm a migrant, and I prefer the diversity. But not, obviously, I can almost feel the YouTube comments before I say it. But there's other people who think differently. Demographic benefits is really the big one. If you're bringing in younger people, so I came in on an under 30s visa, I got extra points for being under 30. You're improving the dependency ratio, at least in the short term. You're slowing the aging of the population. You're increasing the participation rate and the tax take. I mean, of course, the counter argument is this is kind of a Ponzi scheme, because even migrants like myself, well, we get old eventually, and therefore you need more people. It's like a big pyramid scheme to keep things going, and that's kind of the dynamic that we have set up. So we need that endless population growth to sustain given the low fertility rates. And I suppose back to you after this one, Chris, the fourth point is skills, because migrants bring different skill sets, expertise, innovation. The bulk of the permanent migrant program, about 70% of it, is based on skilled migrants through the skill stream. So in that sense, we're bringing in skills that Australia doesn't necessarily have enough of. So those are really the four main benefits. But from a demographics point of view, yes, it's lots of young taxpayers who help to improve the dependency ratio and increase the participation rate.
Yeah, and I think if you think about a lot of countries around the world that have got a declining increasing dependency ratio, it's a lot of less people working for the people that are sort of retired. I think that's going to be. I mean, our super system is pretty good, to be honest. I think that was extremely smart 30 years ago to set that up and to ahead of this problem that was going to happen. Right, if we don't get people to save for their retirement, it's going to fall on us as a country. And on top of that, a strong migration, more taxpayers that will help subsidize people who haven't got enough super, who do need help in retirement. And, if you team that with people living longer and longer and longer, it's a real issue. And, the pressure on our aged care, and I think that's even an issue in itself. That's why we need a lot of migration here, is we're going to need a lot more people here to help our older generation. And, but there's countries around the world that have got that wrong. If you look at sort of Japan, for an example, I mean, there was all of the case study, but they've got a real issue, China as well, etc. So I don't know. I think that's I'm the same as you, Pete. I love travel. I love learning about new cultures and food and different ways to look at the world, and understanding people's different experiences of how they grow up. I think I think it gives you a lot of gratitude for just how lucky you are to be born in Australia, and I think it also gives you a lot more knowledge. And I don't know. I just always embrace that. I think it's a really good thing. But and I think as a city, as a country, you'd have to say we've managed it pretty well. We haven't got crime and major issues like that. Just have compared to what's going on in the world, I would say that we're pretty stable, steady country, right? And so you couldn't not to say people don't have issues, but I think so. I don't know. But I do think people just get on the camp and they have their own view on this, and they just say anti-migration because of these reasons, but they're personal preferences, I guess. I think there's a lot of benefits at an economy level, but we're having challenges right now dealing with it, mainly because of underbuilding and the influx just over the last few years, together with just some of the market. And I think a lot of these things will wash out. I think universities will be full. They can't have any more people. Maybe Aussies will start traveling a bit more again and take job opportunities around the world. And maybe those numbers will just start going back to how they were, 5 years ago. It's not like we've got this new baseline at 500,000-600,000 people a year net increase. I just don't think that's going to be the case. I think it was very likely that when COVID, that there was never, everyone was talking about migration and property prices are going to fall off a cliff. And I was like, well, they're probably just going to bounce back. They're going to, try to refill the universities once COVID doors open up. And that's what's happened. And maybe we're just going to go back to that sort of that mean. Is that your take, Pete? That a lot of these issues are just a sort of a symptom of the system failure right now. They're not going to be long-term issues.
I think, yes. I mean, in every housing shortage, people think it will go on forever. And then at some point, there's a building boom, and then suddenly the housing shortage is, people are talking about oversupply. So I do think that will happen. I think, management of infrastructure has been a harder, longer-term challenge. I was in Perth the other day looking at the traffic snaking out of the CBD, and I thought, we do tend to drive too much in Australia. The use of public transport has always been a bit mixed, to say the least, and that's a challenge for Sydney and Melbourne. I think just on the management of immigration, as somebody who spends a lot of time in London, I mean, it's really clear when you come to Australia, just things work. People aren't, generally anyway, have not really experienced the uplift in crime. In London, they had 40,000 phone thefts last year, and there's graffiti, and people aren't paying to get on the tube, and there's lots of things where people just feel like there's been a bit of a breakdown in law and order. Then you come back to Australia, and yes, there are some issues, but generally things have been managed, despite the big numbers in the last 5 years, much better. But the reality in Europe, of course, is that a very small portion of people, like maybe 1% or less of the population, are causing a lot of the problems, and that's not being well tackled. But if you go to other cities that have run sort of big programs like Dubai or even cities like Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, they've managed these things very well, and Australia has generally done the same. I think when you actually look at demographic flows, it's pretty interesting, because most new migrants to Australia go to Sydney and Melbourne, because those are the big cities with the most employment opportunities. And as a migrant, they're really the only places we know. Of course, I didn't know much about Darwin before I came to Australia. But then internally, people tend to move. Often they move away from the capital cities if they want to get on the housing ladder. Sometimes people move to southeast Queensland for lifestyle changes or affordability reasons. So the demographic flows tend to be the most new arrivals to Australia come to Sydney and Melbourne, but then internally we move around and find these pockets. So that's one of the ways that the pressure valve gets released. I mean, you could certainly. I think the balanced view is Australia's immigration system. It generally does prioritise skilled migrants and people who are going to contribute to the economy, and that's why it's worked so well over the past 20 years. The points-based visa system. I know in the UK, every politician seems to say we need to have a system more like Australia, but then it never really happens. But Australia generally, it's been quite hard to get in. Certainly, I remember when I applied, it was very difficult, even with professional qualification and being under 30 and with English language. But it's by and large worked really well as a result of that. On the public sentiment point, you're right. If you go on social media, it's always very binary. People are either for or against these things. But the reality is Australia's always had immigration. Whether the numbers stay at the current very high levels, I think they might just moderate a bit as things normalise. And then I think housing construction will pick up again, and we'll get through this blip.
It's been a good episode, Pete. I'm sure we're going to get some comments, and I think what we'll do on a future 2 Cents episode is sort of talk through. And so send your questions through. If there's anything we've missed or we got wrong in your view, just let us know. So we're just two guys having a crack here and just try to have a discussion around something. And I do think it's a very topical, and hopefully it was a good episode. So thanks for the chat, Pete, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, send in your comments and questions. Yeah, the big Australia was really if you go back to the Kevin Rudd years, that was the big debate. Should we target a big Australia? And it seems to be that's the way Australia is heading. I suppose the question, a lot of the questions are around, well, how quickly, and does it need to be a race, and what's the right level of immigration, and the pros and the cons. But yeah, definitely, send in your comments and questions. Always keen to hear feedback, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. And of course, every Sunday morning we do our weekly 2 Cents episode as well. Cheers, Chris. Been a pleasure.
Talk soon.
Thanks for watching this episode of the podcast. If you want to hear more from us, you can get daily videos and podcasts on Rask's YouTube channel, or if you want to enroll in a free course on investing, property, business, money, you name it, you can join over 34,000 other students and enroll in a free course on the Rask website. Simply head to www.rask.com.au and follow the prompts. Thanks for watching this Rask podcast.